Thank you so much for joining us. It is my great privilege to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Roberto Gonzales is the Richard Perry University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with appointments in the Department of Sociology and the Graduate School of Education. His research focuses on factors that shape and reduce economic, legal, and social inequalities among vulnerable and hard-to-reach youth populations as they transition to adulthood. And since 2002, Professor Gonzales has carried out one of the most comprehensive studies of undocumented immigrants in the United States. His landmark book, titled Lives in Limbo, Undocumented and Coming of Age in America, is based on an in-depth study that followed 150 undocumented young adults in Los Angeles for 12 years. Lives in Limbo, an extraordinary book, has won 8 major book awards, including the C. Wright Mills Award, given by the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the American Education Research Association Outstanding Book Award. It has also been selected by a number of universities as a common read text and has been used by dozens of school districts and community institutions to train staff. And the book was recently optioned for theatrical production, so we are eager to see its many afterlives. Professor Gonzales's other books include Within and Beyond Citizenship, Borders, Membership, and Belonging, and Undocumented Migration. In addition to publishing his work in top, very prestigious scholarly journals, he has also written opinion pieces for the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and The Guardian. An active public scholar, Professor Gonzales has advised a broad range of stakeholders in the private and public sectors, has briefed members of the US Congress, has testified on matters of immigration policy before the US Senate. And at Penn, Professor Gonzales is the founding director of the newly formed Penn Migration Initiative, a university-wide effort aimed at advancing and promoting interdisciplinary scholarship and intellectual exchange around issues of immigration policy and immigrant communities. Prior to his appointment at Penn, Professor Gonzales held faculty positions at Harvard University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Washington. Professor Gonzales, what a joy and privilege to introduce you. I want to say welcome to Penn, and thank you so much for helping us launch the public events for this year's Forum on Migration.
And thank you all for joining me remotely. I'm really grateful to the Wolf Center for its flexibility and grace and providing the opportunity to do this remotely. I know that that we would much rather all be together and have all of this behind us, but here we are 18 months in. This is my first talk at Penn and as a faculty member, and I'm incredibly honored to join this vibrant community and also to be kicking off this year's Forum on Migration. So my talk tonight is a slightly different title, DACA Dualities and the Limits of Semi-Citizenship. I want to talk a little bit more about that. So I want to share with you this evening some work in progress on my new book that I'm writing with 2 former students, Ben Roth, who's an associate professor at the University of South Carolina in social work, and Christina Brandt, who is a newly minted PhD and assistant professor at Penn State in rural sociology. Christina is also the coordinator for my 7-year DACA study. So following up on the 12-year study that I carried out for my book, Lives in Limbo, we set out to learn in real time the effects of widened access and deportation relief through DACA. So I'd spent 12 plus years on the research for Lives in Limbo, following young people and 10 years before that, as a youth worker in Chicago, working with immigrant families. And so I'd spent a lot of time thinking about the ways in which blocked access and exclusion really narrowly circumscribe the lives of young people. And so I felt it was really important when President Obama announced DACA to study the effects of widened access. So we had undertaken a very ambitious mixed methods, multi-sided longitudinal study. We surveyed nearly 2,700 young people, and our research team spoke to nearly 500 DACA beneficiaries across 3 waves, so 3 separate interviews. And we had learned so much about the changes that DACA beneficiaries were making in their lives to their new access, due to their new access. And so for many of them, right away in short order, they had acquired driver's licenses, they had obtained employment that matched their education, they had improved their financial circumstances, they had obtained better living arrangements, they purchased new cars, those with children now had greater financial flexibility to enroll their young ones in daycare programs. DACA beneficiaries had also experienced enhanced feelings of security, belonging, and overall well-being. They were able to support their families, and those who obtained DACA in their teen years were able to gain access to these benefits on time with their peers, smoothing otherwise turbulent transitions to late adolescence and young adulthood. So becoming documented came with sharp improvements over most areas of their lives. As such, DACA has been hailed as a wide success by many Americans. Yet, as DACA offered the opportunity to recast educational and career goals, its inclusionary power was limited. So beneficiaries remained ineligible for federal financial aid. For college, their DACA status did not offer them any pathway to legalization. And they, at all times, they risked having their status rescinded, leaving them deportable. So we set out in late 2019, early 2020, to write this book. And then in March of 2020, the pandemic hit. And so like many others, probably on this call, we're a bit behind on our work. For me, this last year was a little more than a little overwhelming. So I've got a kiddo, so virtual learning for my kid all the way through April, getting used to Zoom and teaching oversubscribed classes, while also trying to support the evolving needs of my students at Harvard and staying on top of my other work as a faculty member. It was a challenge, to say the least, to keep up with this. So beginning in January, I started reading books, mostly novels. I needed some additional anchoring amid the chaos and uncertainty of COVID. So I set a reading goal of 53 books for the year. I wasn't getting too far on my own book, so I thought that this might help me feel more productive. Who knows, I might even find some inspiration or a fresh way to look at my books, to look at my own work, rather. So I've read some great new books. I've read some classics that I never read. Some classics that I reread, a lot of mysteries. And really, for me, the last time that I had a reading goal like this was book karate in 5th grade, where I read 25 books for my black belt. As of today, I've read 72 books. And so my goal now is 100 for the year. So right around book number 33, when I heard about Richard Wright's new book, The Man Who Lived Underground, not a new book, but a newly released book, I was very excited. I had read Black Boy and Native Son in college, and I was really excited about this book. And when I dug into it, a light bulb went off. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with this work, the book is a re-release of a shorter and edited version that was published in 1945. And the story centers around Fred Daniels, a Black man married and expecting a child, who was picked up by the police after a double murder nearby where he was working. And he is beaten and tortured until he ultimately confesses to a crime that he didn't commit. After signing a confession, Daniels escapes from custody and he flees into the cities. He flees underground into the city's sewer system, where he spends several days underground. And as days pass, and as Daniels loses track of time and a sense of where he is, his invisibility moves him into a kind of liminal space that liberates him from racism, from the persecution, and for him, the facade of the American dream, and gives him perspective, a perspective that enables him to kind of stand outside of the law and apart from his life above ground, and to see it with new eyes. So there's much more to talk about this book, and you know, I'm sure that we could have whole seminars on this. But what was especially useful for me was this notion, as Wright shows us, that his life, Daniel's life, snaps into two, right? His world above ground and his world underground. And this really, for me, really kind of, I had this awakening, and this zapped me back into kind of thinking around my own book and some of the parallels that my team and I had seen, and how the acquisition of DACA snapped people's lives into two. So lives of new lives of belonging and inclusion on one hand, but at the same time, an inability to escape their vulnerability. So I really kind of picked up this idea of duality, and I ran with it. I kept seeing it over and over, and my next book number 34, I intentionally picked up Milan Kundera's Unbearable Liveness of Being. I had seen the movie in college, and this was one of my wife's college books that was on her bookshelf, and I was interested in this duality of lightness and heaviness, but more so in this book, really kind of as Kundera kind of waxes philosophical, he discusses Plato's Symposium, and accordingly, people were the original people were said to have been hermaphrodites, with 4 arms, 4 legs, until the gods grew fearful of their eventual domination and decided to weaken it. So we see the manifestation of this idea of duality when Zeus, the Greek god of kings, decides to split them in two. And so Kundera tells this story of how now these halves now wander the world seeking one another. And for him, love, he suggests, is this longing for the half of ourselves that we have lost. In Roman mythology, we see Janus, the god of transitions and duality, is typically depicted as having 2 faces, looking opposite ways, one towards the past and other towards the future. And then later, by book 36, by coincidence, I came across Britt Bennett's recent novel, The Vanishing Half. And Bennett tells a story of light-skinned African-American identical twins who grew up in the Jim Crow South. So she plays out, in the book, she plays out this very curious scenario So what if one of the twins, Stella, tries to escape the consequences of racism by attempting to pass as white? And in doing so, could evade segregation, discrimination, and violence. So from the moment her attempt in the book is successful, Stella's life splits into two. But the question for her, how long can she keep it up, is one that dogs her for several decades. So shifting this conversation now from the humanities to the social sciences, where I'm admittedly more comfortable. So over the last several decades, social scientists like me have attempted to understand the processes by which different groups adapt and experience life in the United States. So as sociologists studied the stranger, as George Simmel would say, assessments of American assimilation as a, quote, almost natural sequence of interactions resulting in the absorption, modernization, and Americanization of foreigners, end quote, provided this optimistic narrative of linear progress. So as immigrants would slowly shift away from, and these are immigrants, Western and Southern European immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, shifting away from being Irish, German, Polish, Jewish, Italian, and would become American. So as the theory goes, they would shed much of their ethnic identity as they became Americans. So in Milton Gordon's Assimilation in American Life, published in 1964, he theorizes a set of stages that groups go through as they attempt to adapt. So Gordon built on earlier work of Park and Burgess, their race relations cycle, and Warner and Stroll's structural constraints concept to chart out this process that was unidirectional and positive, right? So for Gordon, attainment of the self-image of an unhyphenated American was the endpoint to a process of successful assimilation. So later on, in the after the civil rights movement, and really on the heels of massive demographic change in this country, Herb Gans, another sociologist, modified Gordon's earlier formulation by concurring with, agreeing with Gordon that groups would eventually acculturate and achieve what they were calling structural assimilation. But however, with the caveat that this process might happen in steps. So he referred to this process as bumpy to capture the variation in processes and to illustrate that not every group's assimilation process would be a smooth one. And then finally, Alejandro Cortez and his colleagues developed this segmented assimilation concept to illustrate three different pathways through which immigrants and their children journeyed, including the possibility of downward assimilation. So these traditional and highly contested notions of how immigrants assimilate suggest that this is an adaptive process, which over time leads to social and economic merging with an American mainstream. These ideas also suggest processes which direct individuals on, as I mentioned earlier, a linear course from one social position, in most cases, to a better one. This is how we generally think about getting ahead in our society. Social mobility is often described in terms of pathways, escalators, or ladders. But the historical record is laden with examples that complicate this assimilation narrative. So these examples that challenge this assumption of shedding right? And they point to tensions between institutional structures and human agency that assimilation theory cannot readily explain away. So we think of many examples. I have three examples, and I want to talk about. W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, the history of Mexicans and the paradox facing Asian Americans in this country. But for Du Bois, who was writing about the fractured identity of African Americans at the turn of the 20th century, he observed the Black identity was constantly being filtered through a white lens. Du Bois believed that it was not possible to understand the identity and character of African Americans through one singular Black identity. For him, African Americans had two separate frames of understanding that shaped their perceptions and actions in American society: their self-image as Black and their identity as racialized Americans. We think about this assimilation story. To be sure, you think about the experience of African Americans in this country who become, in many ways, in the language of assimilation, have become acculturated, have become embedded, but still experience a second-class status. And then turning to this duality of the Mexican experience, we can best understand this through the historical tension between the long history of being sought out for their labor. In fact, the story of Mexican migration is the longest and largest labor migration stream in the Western Hemisphere. So integrated through their labor, but socially excluded. Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans alike have been long-standing targets of racial nativism that has repeatedly defined persons of Mexican descent as foreign, legally, politically, and culturally, and has made it easier to frame them as outsiders and quote unquote illegal. And then turning to Asian Americans, on the other hand, who found success, and thinking in particular of East Asians, have found success integrating into the higher rungs of the US economy and certain cultural institutions, but have been similarly marked as racial outsiders, deemed not able to assimilate. In her book, Mia Chuan, in her book Forever Foreigners for Honorary Whites, sociologist Mia Chuan argues that for many Asian American ethnic groups, their acculturation, their financial success, and their educational achievement endow them an honorary white status in their personal lives. However, in their public lives, they're reduced to racial categories that construct them as non-white and as foreigners. So you see these three examples, we don't see linear pathways. We see duality, we see paradox, we see other things happening. So I want to turn to what we are conceptualizing as a kind of legal duality. And so while scholars, this long history of trying to understand the stranger, of understanding newcomers, scholars have long sought to understand these adaptation processes. Immigration policy has become increasingly consequential in shaping how immigrants and their children adapt, come of age, and experience life in the United States. Political entrenchment and increasing gridlock in Congress has led to competing visions for overhauling our U.S. immigration policy. Or you poll Americans, most Americans will agree that our immigration system is broken. Many would go as far to say that it is dysfunctional and it is that by design. But nevertheless, our lawmakers have experienced great difficulty passing immigration bills. This is a very, very relevant to today. And the machinery that is US immigration policy has remained in this broken or dysfunctional state. So in absence of federal legislation, presidential administrations, we've seen how that looked, especially under Obama, how it looked under Trump, and we're getting an idea under Biden. These administrations had the dubious task of addressing immigration issues through administrative, not legislative means. So over the last 3 decades, 2 important measures have characterized US immigration policy. First, in the absence of legalization programs, the federal government has created a growing number of temporary, time-limited, and partial immigration statuses. Think about DACA, think about TPS, and there's a whole slew of other temporary policies that don't endow citizenship and that can be taken away at any moment. Cecilia Menjivar has termed these kinds of policies and this kind of positioning as a liminal legality, really challenging kind of our dichotomous conceptualization to highlight the gray areas between legal and unauthorized categories. So these statuses, these liminally legal statuses like DACA, provide important means for access and inclusion, but don't go all the way, and their limitations are notable. So second, beginning in the 1900s, there's been early 1900s, there's been a continual buildup of heavy immigration enforcement, resulting in record number of deportations. And this enforcement has extended from our border through to our nation's interior. So we're talking about neighborhoods, public spaces, parks, bus stops. And this escalation of enforcement has meant that living with a temporary legal status is even more tenuous today. Right? So in this context, living within the confines of a legal duality is laden with a measured hope, laden with a measured hope and real fear. So ultimately, liminally legal statuses like DACA endow their beneficiaries with a dichotomous duality of both security and vulnerability. So instead of lying, but we, as we've thought about this, instead of lying somewhere in this gray area between legality and illegality, what we found with DACA beneficiaries is that they're experiencing both polar extremes and that they're moving back and forth depending on time, place, and situation. So they're feeling fully included in some spaces and also fully vulnerable in others, right? So while one set of experience may be salient at a particular moment, the other never fully goes away. So instead of linear trajectories, upwards or downwards, beneficiaries' experiences are more like a seesaw. So we think about our childhood and that long, narrow board supported by a single pivot point midway between both ends. We might recall the sensation of moving up and down. As one end of the seesaw goes up, the other goes down. And so for DACA beneficiaries, from one moment to the next, they may be riding high due to successful career pursuits or a feeling of inclusion, but then come crashing down to the ground due to a delay in processing a renewal application that leaves them out of status, or a roadway encounter with law enforcement. The rhythm may be slow and steady or abrupt and chaotic. The seesaw may move back and forth with regular consistency or stay stuck in one place for a considerable amount of time. So I want to turn to our study very briefly, from 2012 to 2019, I assembled a very large team. Lives in Limbo was really me driving the entire project. Excuse me, here I'm supervising a very large team of 65. So in 2012, we carried out a national online survey. This was right at the beginning of DACA. And at that time, beneficiaries had really only had their status, many of them for a few months. So nearly 2,700 young adults, we carried out in-depth qualitative face-to-face interviews with nearly 500 young people, 408 of which ultimately became DACA beneficiaries, 2015, 16, and 2019, in 6 sites in Phoenix, Arizona, and Los Angeles, California, Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, Chicago, and Greenville, South Carolina. And so I want to go to what we learned. And again, this is really just months after the receipt of DACA that our survey respondents were taking giant leaps towards the American mainstream. They were again accessing new job opportunities. They were increasing their earnings. They were starting to build credit through opening up bank accounts, credit cards, obtaining new forms of healthcare, passing driver's tests for driver's licenses. Really, this status almost overnight catapulting these young people in a very, very different position, right? The young women and men that we spoke to were also had experienced less fear in their everyday lives. 2/3 told us they were less afraid of law enforcement. About the same percentage also told us that they were less afraid of being deported themselves. Nearly 70% of them told us that they felt less stress in their everyday lives. Right? They also articulated a greater sense of belonging. Jen from Los Angeles told us that that it gave me hope that my future is not up in the air anymore. Max from New York said, I finally feel like I'm part of the US, like I'm no longer living in the shadows. And Jenny from Chicago said, I feel like it saved my life. But for many of those we met, and I want to stop here and say that it would not be a stretch to argue that this policy, this DACA program, has been the most successful policy of immigrant integration in the last 3 decades or so in the United States. But for many of those we met, the limitations of their status loomed. This is a status that for beneficiaries carries a two-year window, and so at the end of every 2 years they have to apply again. And so here's Oscar from Phoenix describing this feeling of always having to start from scratch. And Oscar tells us, he says, once you have to renew it, the status that is, you have to start from scratch. Out of nowhere, just because 2 years are done, they treat you like you're nothing. You got to go through the process all over again. That means that you could be fired, or you could go without a job for a couple of months because you need to renew something that they already know that you have. And we met many young people who, over the course of the time that we were interviewing them, had at some point fallen out of status, mostly to administrative error in processing. And for them, what that meant was, for many of them, having to leave their place of work. And for many of those, oftentimes those jobs were never available for them once they were able to secure their renewal. The young people that we met also told us about this kind of new glass ceiling that they were experiencing as DACA beneficiaries. Many of them, like Esperanza, who I write about in Lives in Limbo, who at the end I write about her experience with DACA. She's 31 years old by the time she got it. She had been working for several years. She had a long line of low-wage jobs in restaurants and call centers and factories. But when it came time to applying for higher skilled work, she had a very thin resume. So many grappled with what it meant to lack the experience and not be competitive on a job market. For many of them, while DACA for some periods of time, it has started and stopped, and they've been able to apply for what's called advanced parole and leave the country. But that's not always a sure thing, and it requires an application process. And so that is a deterrent for many young people seeking work opportunities that require travel. And then there are barriers to occupational licenses. There's some 96 professions that require an occupational license. But DACA beneficiaries as a category of non-citizens are not eligible for these license programs. And so many of them went through programs only to be told in the middle of the program, or even after completion of the program, that they weren't eligible for the license. And then there are restrictions on government employment. So this very real effect of this glass ceiling placed extreme limitations on young people. And then there's this constant fear of being picked up. DACA provides a stay of deportation, meaning that it directs priorities in enforcement away from them. These young people are still deportable. They still remain deportable. And so here's Eddie from Phoenix, who told us that he had what he likened to kind of PTSD. He said, I try not to think about being deported when it does happen, like saying I'm driving fine, driving the speed limit, hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. Then I see a cop behind me. I think, was I speeding? Was I going 5 above the speed limit? Did I turn? When I turned, did I use a signal light? Is he looking at me? Is he looking at my skin? I think, am I going to get deported if I get stopped? Am I going to go to jail and then get deported? And if I do get deported, am I going to get deported where I live, or I used to live? Or are they going to send me far away? They're going to be like, oh, he lives over here. Let's send him over there. If he does stop me, is he going to take my car away? Where's he going to go? My mom, how are they going to get help? All of that goes through my head. It affects me mentally, physically, and emotionally. Every time I read this quote, I get stressed out. It's a lot. This is a lot for young people to be contending with several times during the course of a day. And then we think about this seesaw and the spaces and places that may tip this either way. In the absence of federal immigration reform, we've also seen localities, municipalities, counties, states try to come up with their own solutions to their immigration issues more locally. And what we've seen is really a uneven landscape of immigration policy and enforcement, so that in certain places, in California, for example, undocumented immigrants and DACA beneficiaries have access to state financial aid and state tuition, driver's licenses, access to occupational licenses that's not tied to a DACA status. But in South Carolina or Georgia, for example, undocumented immigrants are excluded from in-state tuition. In Georgia, excluded from many of the state's top public universities, whether or not they have DACA status. As I mentioned, the access to occupational licenses, while there are 96 in the United States that require occupational licenses, states also have their own occupational licensing requirements. And some states have passed bills permitting DACA beneficiaries to access these licenses, as I mentioned, California, while others haven't. And then navigating immigration enforcement, whether it be in a sanctuary city, sanctuary university campus, or a county that has 287G policies in place, and that those are enhanced cooperation, so really integration between local law enforcement and federal ICE officials. And so where one lives today dramatically shapes experiences of exclusion and belonging. And then if we look at DACA as a policy that has addressed a sizable and significant segment of a larger population, it is still a segment, and a much smaller segment of a population. You know, we're talking about somewhere in the area now of 650,000 or more. I think that at the most about 820,000 young people have held a DACA status. Compare that with the larger population of 10.5 million. We see that there's a much larger population that is not covered, but is also vulnerable, and that the young people that we've met, who, although they've been able to extend the benefits of their status to their family members, many of their family members remained vulnerable. Back to our survey, the survey of 2,700 young people, 70% of those that we surveyed said they knew somebody who had been detained or deported, and more than 65%, almost 2/3, that's a typo, worry all or most of the time that someone that they know would be deported. You know, here's Angela from Atlanta, very similar to an earlier quote. Angela says, I'm always scared. What if my mother gets deported out of nowhere? What if my older sister doesn't fix her status? What's going to happen with her daughters? How's my brother-in-law going to take care of things? And how's he going to handle it? They're all very close. They live together. There's still a lot of fear in my family. So for many DACA beneficiaries, while this status has allowed them in many ways to soar, right, it has given them wings, their roots have been also important in this story, and important to them, I might add, but more so than ever before, these young people are tethered to family members, and many of those that we've talked to have told us that they, you know, with their status, they're paying many of them are very, very proud of this fact, paying extra shares of bills or rent or mortgage, and they're driving their parents to and from work or appointments. And many of them are, as I mentioned, are very proud of this, are very, very feel a lot of pride in being able to impact their family and to help out their family members. But nevertheless, this status has also presented some new dilemmas for them. And so for these young people, many of these young people are contending with a status that is renewable every 2 years, with a status that is on very shaky ground. In 2017, the Trump administration moved to terminate DACA. That's gone through the courts. A recent court decision in Texas put a stop to new applications. And so for many of these young people and their families, their futures look as opaque as they were prior to 2012. So thinking about this, Carlos from Phoenix, really, I think really puts this in clear terms. She says that now my future is stressing me out because of who I am and what I don't have. What I have are problems. What I don't have is a solution for my future. Now I'm stressing out about my future rather, because it's not clear. And then Susan from Los Angeles, she puts this crystal clear. She said, I feel like DACA changed my life. Remember the young person from Chicago earlier. She says, yeah, it changes life, but I don't know if it really changes the future for me. And that I think that is really profound. You got this policy that has allowed in the short term, really giant gains for young people, but it hasn't settled for them questions about the future. So many young people are living with this expiration date. And this expiration date could be the day of the expiration of their current DACA. It's terminated or something happens to them. Here's Rada from New York. Rada told us it's emotional because you learn to love a place and you learn to grow there. And then any day someone can decide that that's not going to be your place. The fact that to a large extent you don't have control over your life. You can have control over what you want to eat today, maybe what shoes you want to wear. You don't have control over those big things that make a huge impact. And so as they say, as Rada said, it's hard to plan for things. So finally, I want to turn to this idea for these young people of imagining, but also planning for dual futures. Jenny from Chicago told us this. She says, in 10 years, and she's thinking about her future plans. In 10 years, I hope to be some kind of elected official. She has high aspirations, or at least run for school board. I'm working hard to get there, but it would definitely not happen if my immigration status didn't change. Leticia from Atlanta then tells us if it does come to that, if it does come to her having to leave the country, what am I going to do? It'd be really hard to survive in Mexico, but if it happens, it's going to happen. So that's why I'm preparing for it, trying to save up. I have a sister who lives there, so I can go to that town. I can find a small apartment, maybe get her support for a little while till I can get on my feet. So what you see happening is that these young people in crafting these dual futures, what they're doing is thinking about and planning for a future that goes one way, but simultaneously thinking about and planning for a future that goes another way, a future in the United States and a future outside of it. So what can we draw from all of this? And just to summarize, this is as I mentioned before, arguably the most successful policy of immigrant integration in recent decades. And so DACA as a semi-legal status, I'm thinking about another notable one, TPS or temporary protected status. So semi-legal status is like this has given beneficiaries and their families a giant boost, right? Access to a set of rights that they didn't previously have. right? It's also powerfully shaped personhood and agency, right? Full stop. I think that it's very, very difficult to argue with these statements. But as policies that are administrative, not through legislation, the temporary and partial nature of them leaves many issues unaddressed. And it's created, as I mentioned before, some new dilemmas. Certain dynamics, as I try to outline here, produce a very uneasy duality. So just as DACA beneficiaries occupy a legally ambiguous position, their access to the polity is often shaded and at times threatened by their sense of vulnerability. While as a semi-legal status, DACA offers some protection against vulnerability, the structural constraints render that boundary porous and thin. We hope that through this work and through really trying to understand these policies, these semi-legal, these legally liminal policies, to contribute to a broader conversation about dualities that moves us from these kind of linear trajectories of American assimilation, but also in the policy sphere moves us away from one-size-fits-all policy, that we can understand that while structures can exert a powerful force on people's lives, their agency, I want to end with this, their agency really helps them, their agency and their capacity, their self-determination really shapes uneasy pathways. My wife teases me that I talk slowly and that I talk a lot, and so I want to take this moment to thank you. Thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to Q&A. Stop sharing.
All right. Thank you so much, Roberto, for such a rich presentation. And just a reminder to everyone, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. Okay, some questions are coming in, so and I'm very happy to moderate them. All right, so the first question, Roberto, is do we have to retreat from our reliance on the state for legitimacy, given its own geopolitical agenda that comprises rights of undocumented immigrants, compromises rights of undocumented immigrants, and enforces border restrictions? It's a multi-pronged question. What is your opinion about sanctuary cities and providing an alternative model to the state's immigration framework?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that there's a really important debate in there, and that is the enduring power of citizenship. And as I alluded to at the end of the talk, I think that it's important to understand, to fully embrace people's agency, self-determination, and to look at these places, spaces of belonging that immigrants themselves create and recreate in their lives. And I think that there's, in Lives in Limbo, I write a bit about kind of we think about kind of bigger, more giant gestures of success or mobility, and thinking about the kind of assimilation stories. But some of the most kind of powerful examples of agency and resilience and self-determination were young people who were carving out lives, raising families, participating in their community, pursuing hobbies that were not tied, hobbies and even business pursuits that were not tied to their, but ultimately, these spaces also have limits. We're seeing on the border what's happening to Haitians. We've seen over the last decade enforcement that has ripped people apart from their families, and so it's a complicated issue. I don't want to paint a overly structural story. But the nation state still exerts a tremendous amount of power. Sanctuary cities, I had also mentioned sanctuary schools, I think are doing some really important work. But ultimately, I think that people know that if an immigration official comes into a school, onto a campus like Penn's, that there is administrations, the community has only so much a recourse against that kind of those deportation orders.
Yeah. We have another question. It reads, "My DACA friends have had children here since achieving status. Should this be considered in the making of new policy creation?"
Yeah, it's a great question. You think more broadly at a population of 10.5 million people who are living in an undocumented residency status. It's a population of long-term stayers. Vast majority have lived here for more than 15 years. Lived here meaning lived in the United States. There are more than now 17 million people who are living in mixed status families. So you see that people have really grown roots in their communities. They've had children who are born here. And now we have the subsequent generation now of DACA beneficiaries who are having kids, who are growing up here. And so how do we think about this when we think about policy and what sort of immigration policy is just and fair? How do we think about these questions, and how do we think about those who are long-term stayers and also have family members, children, who know no other home? It's a really important question.
We have another question. It begins, "Thank you for this rich and insightful talk. Can you share your recommendations of what needs to be done by activists, but also by scholars, by us in the classroom, in light of these new racialized modes of semi-citizenship that the state has created? How do we challenge them, resist them, and undo some of their dispossessions in the face of the capitalist carceral state?"
Yeah, it's another really powerful question, I think, and I think that part of that is to contextualize what's happening in the United States in a kind of broader global world that we live in, and increasingly so, these statuses as nations are pushing back against formal citizenship, these kind of semi-legal policies are proliferating, right? So that what we're seeing in the United States is just a sign of what is happening globally. And so, to be sure, there are huge limits on citizenship, and I think that my discussion earlier on the experience of African Americans in this country, especially, who have full citizenship legally, but still are still fighting against a kind of second-class status. So what it means is a really rethinking citizenship and what it means and what it is, not only for nation states, but for communities, for families, for individuals. And how do we create something that again is just and fair? So thinking about activists and scholars, and I think that I had a brief exchange with a reporter from the Boston Globe about yesterday's march in Washington, D.C., Immigrant Rights March, and I think that what I'm seeing now, and I'm not offering any advice. I don't think that I can or should offer advice to activists, but I think that what we're seeing is for people who've been paying attention over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there appears to be fewer divisions and a much more unified front. And I think that what we're also seeing is a movement against kind of one of Biden's promises was securing DACA, fortifying DACA. But really, more than that, I think people are pushing against that and pushing for full citizenship, and full citizenship beyond just quote unquote dreamers, but for a larger population that has been here. And I think that's what we're going to see. We've seen many activists who have grown up in these movements, who have a lot of stake in these movements personally, and I think that they are seeing this after 4 years of Trump policy, and really an inability, I think, to organize against that president. Potentially some openings with the Biden administration. Now, his record has not been mixed at best. And we're seeing some images of what's happening with Haitians on the border. But I think that people do believe that he is a president who can be organized against.
All right. Well, this is actually another question, but good complements the one you just answered. The question is your research influencing policy related to DACA and the legal pathway to citizenship? And what is your overall impact goal with your research contributions?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I didn't mention in this talk that prior to graduate school, I spent 10 years in a Chicago community. I write about it in my preface in Lives in Limbo. But I spent 10 years as a youth worker, and I lived and worked in a Mexican and Polish immigrant neighborhood in Chicago, where I started to learn more from a kind of worm's eye view, the kind of the experiences of immigrants, undocumented immigrants, those living in mixed status families, undocumented young people. And I mention that because those experiences, those early experiences in my kind of formative years after college really shaped the way that I think about my research, shaped the way that I think about connections with research participants, how I think about partnerships, research partnerships, and how I think about what research can do. I've been very fortunate to publish my work and for my work to be received well in academic circles. It has been my dual goal in academia of, as scholars do, in building connections, the social capital with policymakers, with think tanks, with community agencies, with a broad range of stakeholders, so that I can leverage this work to contribute in a broader conversation. And so I'm really proud of this work that's not, this is not the kind of numbers that people always want, policymakers always want to kind of know numbers, and people write me all the time. What is a percentage? What is the economic impact of DACA? What has it done? But I'm telling a more kind of nuanced and qualitative story, and I'm very proud that I've been able to position myself, and I hope also others too who are doing this work, in front of policymakers, in front of Congress, in front of school superintendents, in front of foundations, in front of social service agencies, and that's been a real, for me, I think that has been a real kind of mark of success. Can I say that I've changed immigration policy? No, of course not. I would never be that arrogant, but I hope that I've contributed to a conversation and been able to shed some different light, to tell some different stories, to provide some nuance to the discussion.
All right. We have several questions, but I think we have maybe time for two more, and I'll ask them together. The first is, we actually answered earlier that activists are now thinking beyond the confines of DACA, but this question asks, though, what is a more egalitarian version of DACA, which both caters to the state's geopolitical necessities, but also foregrounds the interests of young immigrants without status? That's the first question. And then the second question, I think this is a great way of wrapping up the talk, is what's your next work? What are the big questions that have yet to be explored in the area of the undocumented experience that you plan to study and or hope others will?
Yeah, so I appreciate all questions, and I would also encourage people who didn't get your questions answered to shoot me an email. We are, as I mentioned at the onset of my talk, we're 18 months into a global pandemic that has affected us all. There's no one here, there's no one that I know that has been untouched by this. And so to have a conversation about immigration may be uncomfortable for some people because of the nature of the politics, but also because many people in this country are hurting economically. We've seen death and illness among loved ones, among coworkers, among neighbors. And so how do we think about policy that is fair and just is a very important question, and a question I think that we have to grapple with from all angles. And the way I think about it is this: is that the DACA has been important, and it has really shown us kind of the kind of natural experiment. What happens if we give these young people status? And we've seen the results. But we've also seen that their fates are very strongly tied to their family members. And so we think about a policy, and I'm coming here from a frame of a social problem of inequality, and it's really I think legalization, mass legalization that will raise at least most votes. As I think to the future, this book is now almost 2 years late to the publisher, and so I'm working hard to do this. I'm also working with some colleagues on kind of issues in schools, but I want to finish with this. We're in a really important time right now, and it's important to shine a bright light on what's happening. It's important for us to understand what's happening and the implications and consequences of this particular moment. However, it is equally important that we do not leave research partners, those who we want to study, we don't exacerbate vulnerability. And so it's very important for all of us, whether we're teaching in a classroom, whether we're doing research out in the community, whether we're advocating, we're doing advocacy work, not to put people in harm's way.
Now, I'm going to take the prerogative of moderating, and I'd be remiss as a literary scholar not to ask you about how you set up the presentation and, not to, literary texts and all this reading that you're doing. I'm wondering how it's informing your project. I mean, of course, narrative is central to Lives in Limbo, right? The incredible ethnography that you do, the in-depth interviews, but I'm wondering, just all this reading, how it's helping shape this new project.
Yeah, so it's been really fun, and in a way that I really had to walk the walk. I teach an ethnography class, and for years, I've been telling my students, you got to read more, and you got to read non-academic texts. You want to think about how writers establish a setting, how writers deal with dialogue, how writers develop characters. We really want to read widely and deeply and turn to literature. I had Min Jin Lee in my class. She visits my first day in the ethnography class at Harvard, and she was wonderful. But I think that returning to my book karate days of the 5th grade, I'm really enjoying this, and I really want to. I'm really hoping that this reading is helping me to engage the text more deeply, and to write in a way that is to draw inspiration from some of these heavyweights like James Baldwin, for example, and to write about the characters that we've met through this project in depth, in full dimension, in their complexity, and I hope to learn from many of those works.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Roberto, for such a rich talk, and we are all eager to see the book in our hands. And again, just thank on behalf of the Wolf Humanities Center, thank you for helping us launch our season of programming. I also want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, evening. We hope to see you again next week on October 6th for the next program on our Forum on Migration. The event is titled The Art of Migration, with curator Hur Al-Qasimi of the Sharjah Art Foundation and the director of the Sharjah Biennale, and our Penn scholar, Sonal Kolar, who's a professor in the History of Art department. Thank you all again. Many thanks, Roberto, and hope we will see you all next week.